This story takes place in a very small town in the northeastern United States in the summer of 2015, just before I left for college. After I graduated from high school, my parents decided to move to a smaller and more affordable house about 45 minutes north in the mountains. We stayed in my childhood home because the public schools in my neighborhood were the best in the state and my parents valued my education. As a result, I went to a great university, and now I have an incredible career thanks to my excellent education. As most people in the US know, a good public education usually means higher property taxes. My parents got to the point where they could no longer pay taxes on their 4,000 square foot home. They decided to sell it right after I graduated. Their house is modest, standing on a beautiful piece of land, on the side of a beautiful mountain. The trees are always green, and there is a lot of wildlife around. They don't have many neighbors because their driveway is about 1.5 miles long, but that was the house they decided to live in after I left for college. In August 2015, we moved into the new house. I didn't plan on staying here for long as I was getting ready to enter college as a freshman. We decided to have a small housewarming party with a group of family friends, and my best friend at the time came too. My dad would barbecue, my mom would make drinks, and we would play with the dogs. It was a really good time, and everyone had a lot of fun. My dad built a brick fire pit in the backyard. The pit was about 30 feet from the back door of our patio, surrounded by a picnic table and other seating. You could see the tree line behind the seats, and some nights it was incredibly dark. You needed a flashlight to see at least 10 feet in front of you. When the fire was burning, you couldn't see anyone but those sitting next to you or across from you in front of the fire, and I mean it was really hard to see. Anyway, my best friend decided to stay the night, and we asked my dad if we could make dinner. As it was getting a little chilly, as it usually does in late summer in the Northeast at night, my parents left us outside with my dog Nino. Nino was a huge 100-pound pit bull, black Labrador manor. He was such a loyal and incredible dog that my dad trained as his right-hand man. He was our protector because he could run very fast, was very strong, and would warn us if something was going on at night. By the way, he died a week before my wedding in 2022. He was 17 years old and had lived an adventurous life with my parents, hunting squirrels, basking in the sun, and running, so he had a good life. However, Nino was lying between us facing the woods, and my best friend was on my right. We lay with our backs to the dark, dense woods, and that was our first mistake. We laughed together, made jokes, ate sivu, made plans for the future, and were generally excited to go to college together. She decided to put on some music, and we just chilled out, feeling content and relaxed. It was almost a perfect summer night until Nino started roaring. I saw him perk up his ears and tilt his head to the side. Then he sat up and continued to cry. My best friend and I glanced over, deciding that Nino had just heard a stray animal or something non-threatening. There were lots of deer in the area, and it was rare to see a coyote or wolf. Since he was trying to help my dad hunt deer, we figured it was a deer or fawn in the distance behind us. So we're back to singing along to the music and discussing the fall 2015 schedule. But then, Nino started roaring again, and that was our second mistake. We didn't call Dad. We didn't even think it was a problem until Nino started barking again and again, louder and angrier this time. He got up and started barking, as if alerting us to activity behind the tree line that we couldn't see. At this point, we got up too, as the fire blocked our view. My best friend picked up her phone, paused the music, and turned on her flashlight. She went to the edge of the forest. Nino was beside her, still roaring and barking, warning us not to go any further and calling for help. We stood in silence, listening. At that point, I was afraid to even breathe, but she went into the woods, and as she shined the flashlight, she saw a figure. Someone was there, looking behind the tree. A man in a green suit and green pants, 6 feet tall, wearing glasses. We screamed and ran inside as fast as we could, leaving unattended the bonfire and that horrible man behind the tree. At the time, we didn't know where the man had come from. Anyway, we broke in the front door, breathing heavily, with Nino on our backs, startling my mom, who was washing dishes and cleaning up after the party at the time. She was talking to my dad about something they'd seen on the news, and I think we interrupted him halfway through to explain that there was a man dressed in all green behind the tree in the woods. Of course, we didn't know how long he had been there, or if he was still there, but we both cried. I remember feeling really bad, like I was about to get a phone call. My dad jumped up, grabbed his gun and flashlight, and ran outside with Nino. My mom gathered us in the living room, turned off the lights in the house and locked the door. She advised us to be quiet and said she was going to call 911. While she was doing this, my best friend and I were shaking with fear. We expected gunshots and screams at some point, but luckily we didn't hear anything. My mom, who was on the phone with 911, described to the operator what we had seen, and I heard my mom say "oh" in a very anxious manner. At this point, my dad came back into the house and my mom informed him that the police were on their way. Since we live in a small mountain town of less than 10,000 people, that means we don't have our own police force, and every time an ambulance call comes in, we call the state police. My dad hid his gun and waited outside for the police to show up. And to our surprise, they sent not 1, but 10 police officers, an entire SWAT team and a helicopter to fly around the neighborhood. We were clearly and justifiably terrified. At this point, I practically had a panic attack. The police came to our house and asked me and my best friend what the man was wearing, what he looked like, etc. Did we see any scars or tattoos? We explained that we had matching green suits and goggles. The officer stepped aside and informed the police and SWAT team that we were outside the station. They started searching the woods behind our house with guns at the ready, flashlights and helicopters circling over the house. They advised us to stay inside and informed us that they would let us know if and when they found anything. About 25 minutes later, there was another knock on our door. This time it was not 1 but 2 officers. Dad let them in and they began to explain the situation. One of the officers explained that we must have seen on the news how a convicted felon had escaped into the mountains from a prison about 20 miles away. The police had apparently set up a 10-mile perimeter around the jail, but the perp had somehow escaped them again. The clothes the man was wearing and our description made them realize that the escaped felon was 100% hiding that night in our remote, overgrown, heavily wooded yard. At that time in my state, a green suit was standard prisoner attire. However, in 25 minutes of searching, they never found the man near us, meaning he was still somewhere nearby. The officers informed us that they were going to leave the patrol car and monitor our home for several days because they had been unable to locate the fugitive and believed he was still an active threat to our safety. That night, and the next 3 nights, we all slept in the living room. My father's shotgun was also always at arm's length from him. Later that week, officers outside our house knocked on our door again. They informed us that the man had finally returned to the police and that we were now safe. They advised us to buy surveillance cameras and expressed regret that this had happened to us. After that, my parents spent about $10,000 on security cameras and fencing in our backyard. It's now completely fenced in, and we have about 4 cameras constantly monitoring the tree line. And I think since you never know what will happen or what will happen at night, it might be worth it. This incident happened to me and a friend from out of town whom I had invited to go hunting one afternoon. This place was in South Louisiana, in a dense forest with palmettos up to 6 feet tall, and the water we had to wade through to get to my deer pens was sometimes waist deep. So the mile we had to walk to the campground was slow going, and my friend wasn't used to such difficult terrain. But he kept up, and when I got to the first post, which was about 15 feet off the ground, with ladders to climb, I told him I'd be there to pick him up in about half an hour after dark, as I was about half a mile away. The full moon reflected in the water, which allowed us to hunt for a few minutes longer, and when it was too dark to see anything, I got off the deer stand with my rifle on my shoulder and walked slowly toward my friend. To get him, and when I was almost near his stand, I sanctified the up, but he wasn't on the stand, so I shined my flashlight on the ground at the foot of the stand, and he was sitting with his back to the tree where the stand stood. And what was strange was that he didn't look in my direction, even when I called his name. Then I came within a couple of feet of him and asked him if he was ready to go. And then finally, he turned his head and looked in my direction, and what I saw in his face startled me so much that I took off my rifle, my shoulder, putting it between me and him. His eyes were rolled up and his mouth was wide open. He just stood there looking at me, not saying a word but not answering me either. I asked him what the hell he was doing and what was wrong, but he didn't answer. And there I was, about a mile back in the woods, and all around us were whole palmettos, waist deep in water, and my good friend was looking at me like he was possessed or something. And yes, at this point I was scared, so I ended up punching him in the face and he seemed to come to his senses. I asked if he was okay, and the only words he said to me were, "Let's get out of here now." So, not knowing what was going on, I made him walk ahead of me all the way to the truck. We got in it and drove off without saying a word. I finally asked him what happened in the woods. Why did he look so shaken or possessed? He cried, and then he started telling me about how he must have been sitting there on the bench when he heard something floating in the water, moving the palmetto as if it were walking, and when he got close enough. Getting closer to see what it was, he said it was a man who looked like he'd been skinned alive. It was like he had no skin at all. And he said he was so scared that after the creature passed him, he went down and hid under a tree so it wouldn't see him when he came back. He was in shock, and when I walked up to him, that's why he looked like that. He was so shaken and crying that I finally had to ask him to stop so I could drive. A week went by, and I was talking to my younger cousin, who was on a field trip to a nearby Indian memorial, and they were telling me how this Indian tribe used to skin the men of their tribe alive and let them loose in the woods when they committed a crime. Serious crime, My friend who witnessed him being skinned a week ago wasn't a local and couldn't have known about it. So what did he see that shocked him? Perhaps it was the ghost of one of those Indians who were skinned years ago. I don't know, but I do. The state my friend was in when I went to see him that night in the woods, I will never forget. With Hello Fresh, you get freshly portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. Give up trips to the grocery store and rely on Hello Fresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why this set of foods is ranked #1 in America. Looking for an easy way to eat right, save money, and enjoy delicious food while listening to scary stories? Cut down on expensive shipping and delivery and start using Hello Fresh. You'll love how fast, easy, and inexpensive it is to make restaurant-quality meals right in your kitchen. You can substitute proteins in side dishes, or even add protein to vegetarian meals. And now you can even order organic chicken or organic ground beef. Personally, I love a good burrito, and their Southwestern pork and bean burrito is delicious. I also found that their ingredients are very well packaged, and the instructions are easy to follow. In my books, it's a win-win. Having quick, fresh meals that taste amazing, and without having to go to the grocery store, which saves me a lot of time in my busy schedule, has been a real lifesaver for me. Also, just so you know, Green Chef is now owned by Hello Fresh, and with a wider selection of meal plans, there's something for everyone. I love switching between brands, and now you guys can enjoy both brands at a discount with me. So go to HelloFresh.com at Bescared60 and use the code Bescared60 to get 60% off and free shipping. It's pretty darn refreshing. Click Bescared60 and use code Bescared60 to get 60% off and free shipping. The #1 grocery meal plan in America. I'm 19 years old and live away from home in a 1-bedroom apartment. I often go to bed late, and last week around 11 p.m. I was just doing laundry when she saw a man sitting in the hall. I've seen it a lot at night, but haven't paid much attention to it. Anyway, I'm in the laundry room. I had just put my clothes in the dryer when I heard the laundry room door creak open, which meant someone had entered. There was a man standing there with no clothes on and just looking at me. I walked past him and headed for the elevators. He quickly followed me, cornered me, and asked for my Snapchat. I was tired and just wanted to get back to my room, so I foolishly gave it to him. I thought he would text and try to be a little flirty, and I would say I have a boyfriend. Sorry if you thought it was something else, and that would be the end of it. I'm about 175 centimeters tall. I have very long red hair. I'm half Indian, half English of Afghan descent. So I may be white, but I'm kind of exotic. But people usually look at me warily because I look a little different. Anyway, He starts texting me, everything seems fine. But then he starts saying weird things like, "I saw you a month ago and I was impressed. I was visiting a friend and I was staying here and I was watching you. I noticed you go out mostly at night." He tells me he's from Saudi Arabia and he's coming here for another 5 days. But then things get even worse. He says, "I love you. I can't do anything about it." And then I tell him I have a boyfriend, and he says all I need is you, and continues to completely ignore it. He asked to come to my room. I said no. Then apparently, he wanted to hug me. He asked me if I lived alone, and if I was a virgin. He kept saying that he loves me, and that I'm perfect for him, that I impressed him. At this point, I recorded all the Snapchat messages, talked to him some more to gather evidence to take to the appointment in the morning. After all, apparently, he had been following me for a month. I asked my boyfriend, who lives on the second floor, to walk me to the laundry room. We were sitting in the student lounge and my friend was reassuring me. At this point, I was shaking with adrenaline and fear. We saw him looking for me in the laundry room again, but thankfully I had already picked him up. I ran back to my room and my friend said I could stay in his room, but I said it was okay. I would just close the door. Then around 1 a.m., I heard someone trying to get into my room and fiddling with the doorknob. I asked my friend if he was outside my room and he said no, and then I just froze. I didn't want to make a sound, but I was nauseous and completely helpless. Thankfully, it eventually stopped, and whoever it was apparently left. I reported it to reception in the morning, and then went to stay with my boyfriend for a few days. After that, I went to London to visit my friend, and last night I stayed in my room for the first time since the incident. But now I'm very paranoid. Alas, I'll probably have to get used to it, but yes, it is what it is. This isn't the first time I've been harassed like this. A guy tried to kiss me in a club by grabbing my head, and a bunch of other stuff happened that I won't talk about here. But anyway, I'm very afraid to leave my room after dark. I keep looking over my shoulder and feeling paranoid. I keep blaming myself for being too cute, and I know it's my long, thick hair that draws people's attention to me. At this point, I just want to cut it all off. But has anyone else had a similar experience? So how did you deal with that? The front desk still hasn't told me if he's still in the building, so what? I think I will go and talk to them in the morning to see how things are going. This incident happened to me a few years ago, and honestly made me a believer in the paranormal, and I hope you find it as interesting and creepy as I did. So I went outside very early in the morning, around 5 o'clock, to take pictures in the forest, because I've always liked the atmosphere of the forest, especially in the morning, because it has a certain peace. I live in central Sweden, where there are many dense forests, much of which is untouched. There's a lot of moss and old growth trees. This particular forest I was headed to was very close to my house. However, since I live in a rural area, I was very lonely this morning with no one around for even miles. Also, there was fog hanging over the treetops from the nearby rivers, which honestly looked really cool, so I was ready to take some really good photos. I entered the forest, parked my car on the road next to it, and went straight in. After walking 100 meters, I stopped to take some pictures, mostly of dead trees, mushrooms, and such. I was in my early 20s and feeling very artistic at the time, so yeah, that was it. But after a few minutes, I started to hear banging in the trees. I figured it must be a bird since we have woodpeckers here, so nothing out of the ordinary. But the weird thing is that I started looking for it because it had come off a tree that was right next to me, but I couldn't find it anywhere. No luck, I thought. I wanted to see if I could get a good photo, but in the end, I decided to move on. I continued walking through the woods when I noticed something. There seemed to be a knocking or smacking sound that followed me as I walked. It kept knocking into the trees next to me. I didn't pay much attention to it at the moment, but that would change after a while. I stopped at one spot that looked really nice to set my camera on a tripod and try to get some cool shots of the surroundings and treetops. I sat down and continued to hear knocking on a tree a few meters behind me, after which I started to feel a little strange, as I didn't notice that it seemed to be following me. A few seconds later, as I was changing the camera settings, I suddenly heard some very loud, distinct and heavy footsteps behind me that quickly came closer and closer until they were right behind me and my whole body instantly froze. such a tingling sensation all over my body I had never felt before. After a few seconds, I took off and turned to look at something that I thought was some kind of large animal. But when I did, there was nothing there. Judging from the context, with the exception of a few trees, this area wasn't that densely populated. Only a few trees here and there, but mostly moss and grass. That meant I needed to see it. Anyway, I gathered all my stuff and quickly went to my car, and then the knocking started again. He followed me the whole way again, and I realized something was taunting me. So I said out loud, "Yeah, I'm leaving." I thought to myself, whatever it was, it didn't want me there. I kept hearing the knocking until I got back to where I first heard it, and then it just stopped. But I didn't. I immediately walked back to my car and drove home. I was skeptical of the paranormal before this incident, but this event changed my views. I've only had one such experience since then, but it scared the hell out of me. About 2 years ago, I, a 16-year-old girl, though I was 14 at the time, was staying home with my mom. There were two of us. My mom at the time had a drug and alcohol addiction and was in a drug-induced coma, so nothing could wake her up. I decided to take a bath while she slept. The bathroom door was closed, as was my mom's bedroom door, because she seemed to think we didn't know about her affections and kept everything under lock and key so we wouldn't find out. So the house was completely silent. I was in the bathroom for about half an hour before I heard the front door open. I assumed it was my older sister coming home from work because no one else would just walk into the house, but I wanted to make sure, so I texted her. But I was immediately very concerned when she said she wasn't home and why. Was there anyone there? I froze. I could definitely hear footsteps now. Our house was small, one story, and from the front door to the bathroom door there was only a small living room, and I heard a squeal as I was walking down the hallway to the bathroom. I heard the squealing stop outside the bathroom door, and then someone grabbed the doorknob and very slowly turned it from side to side for about a minute. The whole time I sat silent, frozen in place and shaking like a leaf. I wanted to call my mom and ask if it was her, but I didn't want whoever it was to hear the sound and get to my mom. After a while, I heard nothing. I sat in the bathroom for what seemed like about an hour until I heard the front door quietly open and close. I stayed in the tub long after the water had cooled until I heard my sister come in and yell out if I was here and if I was okay, and asked why the door wasn't locked. I climbed out of the tub and heard her sigh before I got out, but when I did, my blood instantly ran cold. Along the hallway wall where the paint had peeled off, it was as if someone had run something sharp along the wall. Now there is a theory that the gnashing I heard was the result of someone running a knife along the wall next to the bathroom. I was driving home from Orbis with a mint chocolate shake, and I was distracted for a second and almost didn't notice his car. I tried to just let him pass, but he insisted I ride up front. I ignored it again and just continued on. He drove forward and parked the car near some apartments. He was wearing a black polo shirt, and I figured he had just left something at work or something. As I kept walking, he came up to me and handed me a $20 bill. I asked him why, but couldn't make out what he said. I said no because I know what's best for me. That didn't stop him, though. He grabbed me by the waist and I backed up. He then started dragging me to his car. I bit his arm so he couldn't shut me up, and tried to scream as loud as possible to get the attention of passers-by if possible. Alas, he managed to drag me into the car, and before he could close it, I stuck my foot in the door to keep it from closing. I then got out of my car and forced myself to limp, as this added dead weight, and without warning caused sudden resistance and prevented them from grabbing you. Thanks to that smarts, I managed to get away unharmed. I quickly placed my order and called my mom as soon as I was a safe distance away. I tried to stay focused on the conversation until I got back, but after that, I gave myself time to calm down and waited for the police to arrive to take a statement. The officer ended up commending me for being smart and said that fortunately, I had done the right thing in this situation. But please, guys, take self-defense seriously. I had only had a week's course, and that alone, I think, saved my life that day. I didn't remember too much from the self-defense course and only used the basic techniques I had memorized: making noise, dropping my weight, and checking behind me. All my other actions were the result of logic and smarts. However, chances are that had I had more self-defense training, things probably wouldn't have been as good. Also, never accept money from strangers. While there are good Samaritans out there, there are also some who do not have your best interests at heart. If you believe they have good intentions, be sure to double-check them by asking why they are offering you money. If you don't have a good and legitimate reason, as I do, then by all means say no. If you say no and they still persist, take my advice and leave immediately. In 2017, I was a student living with 3 other students in an unfurnished student house in a big city. For context, let me tell you about the layout of the house. This will also come in handy for the story. My bedroom was the only one on the first floor, next to the front door and across from the kitchen. We only had a front door and front windows, no back door. My bed was in the middle of the room, with the foot of the bed facing the bedroom door. The house had a total of 3 floors, 2 bedrooms on the second floor, and another bedroom and living room on the 3rd floor. So one June evening, we all, along with a few friends who had come over for a drink, decided to go out for a visit. We decided to have a big drunken night on the town to simultaneously celebrate the end of exams, my 21st birthday, and one last big hurrah before everyone went home or left for the summer. I'm not a big fan of clubs in general, so my then boyfriend and I were ready to head home at about 1 o'clock or 1:30 in the morning. We would go back to the Uber, drunkenly eat takeout, and go to bed around 2:30 a.m. V4:30. We were both awakened by one of my roommates slamming the door. "We've been robbed." We rubbed our eyes in surprise, since none of us were awake, and thought she was pulling some kind of terrible prank. Of course, if we were near the front door, we would have heard something. As we climbed the stairs, we discovered the upstairs rooms had been ransacked and belongings were missing. Every electrical appliance that wasn't turned on was gone. Laptops, iPads, cameras, passports were gone too, and my roommate's weed was taken. The baseball cap of a girl whose room was on the 3rd floor was found in another person's bedroom on the 2nd floor. This meant that the intruder had worn a cap and removed it as he walked through the house. And then it hit me. What about my room? I rushed downstairs to check my belongings and found that my purse, which was on the footboard of my bed, was missing, and my ex's phone and wallet, which were also on the footboard of my bed, were also stolen. My laptop was on the bedside table next to me and was untouched. But that means that the intruder or intruders managed to break down the front door, go through the entire house, search the rooms looking for things to steal, and actually open the door of the bedroom we were sleeping in to take things right in front of the bed we were lying on. And we never woke up from all of this. To say I was shocked when I learned of this incident is to say nothing. The police came to take our statements and write a report, but nothing came of it. After that night, I still don't feel like going to bed in an empty house. I am forever grateful that we didn't wake up in the middle of the robbery, and that I went home alone because the outcome could have been very different. I have been asked many times in responses and conversations to share my experience of the Order of St. John Chaplain and the Demonologist. It's very hard to know where to start, but I think the most important thing is to say that these are my beliefs and experiences. I certainly don't judge you for your beliefs, and I certainly don't want to assert any authority over the beliefs of others. As chaplains, we don't belong to a church because we serve in congregations. We have no right to judge anyone in this community, only to care for them and support them in their needs. Also, the cardinal rule of our work is to refute, refute, and refute again. Other than that, to save you the trouble, I'll talk about things in order of increasing interest in them. I'll start with my experience, then I'll talk a little bit about our processes, what I'm allowed to talk about, how I got into this field, and then what training I've had. So that's my experience. Shared and passive paranormal experiences are an integral part of the work. I'll talk more about this later, but I'm not afraid of what goes bump in the night. I used to be afraid, but after studying and understanding the paranormal, it loses interest and becomes more like a puzzle to be solved. My passive experience is like this. For example, every month or so, new people knock on our doors and windows, even though we live in a secure apartment on the 3rd floor. When I'm alone, I get random pokes and prods, whispers, mutterings, growls, scratches, electrical interference, random myths, distorted shadows, and ghostly figures here and there. It's all become a weekly occurrence. Although when I say that it's usually just one of those things that happens, I deal with it and it disappears almost immediately. But this case is probably the most interesting to me because it happens every couple months, and I still haven't solved the mystery. You see, I travel a lot for my job, and at the moment I've been sent to one of our small towns to train people, run mental health programs, or help with large-scale crises. As a result, I have to spend long hours driving, sometimes during the day, sometimes at night. And I see the same stocky figure of a hitchhiker walking along the side of the road in a black hoodie and jeans, hood up and thumb out. Notice I never stopped, and he never once turned around when I approached. I've seen it at all times of the day. Dawn, afternoon, dusk, night. I've also seen this in places that are several hours away from each location. At first, to be honest, I thought it was just a coincidence, but hitchhiking is very rare in our country. We're small and our buses are very cheap, so seeing this guy in so many different places is definitely something. The next incident is another recurring incident, albeit a recent one. Honestly, it's more annoying than anything else, but a few times my partner and I have been woken up by the continuous howling in our bedroom. Our windows are closed, the apartment is fine as I said, but it prevents me from sleeping and I really like to sleep, so it's annoying. I'm grateful for the solution to this problem, but I've had to struggle with it for a few years now. Long story short, whenever I was engaged in the very difficult business of supporting someone in what we call spiritual warfare, I was visited for what it was. Each time it was the same. I dreamt of a figure in a cloak, woke up in the spinning room and gasped. I've had bouts of sleep paralysis before, but this one was definitely different. I'm still half convinced it was some kind of problem or sleep apnea attack. The only thing that makes me think it is paranormal is that it always happened when I dreamt of this figure and stopped after I made some effort to stop it. There are also some clients' experiences that I unfortunately can't share because I have a strict confidentiality agreement with them, and that's on my heart. But in general, I've helped people deal with psychological issues more than spiritual issues. Some of the spiritual questions were fascinating, and I get that feeling when there are obvious signs of oppression or contamination. It was something like a heaviness in my chest and stuffy air. I've helped people by blessing their homes, which is a complicated process that can be somewhat risky depending on your beliefs. Basically, you have to summon the repressive force, challenge it, expose it, and either condemn it or suppress it if it can't be dealt with one blessing. I've also helped people with deliverance, although I don't really like the evangelical deliverance ministry. We belong to a more traditional denomination, but I've never helped with an exorcism. I am still relatively young for my role, and although I am a commissioner of the order, I am not yet an ordained minister or anything like that. So, let's move on to our processes. We have to be careful about what we share, and for a very simple reason. We often have people come to us who either want to mess with us or are desperately waiting for something paranormal to happen. And the information we don't share is actually key information we need to solve cases. I can say, however, that our attitude toward the paranormal is unusual. Everything paranormal in our theology is demonology, angels, or Holy Spirit. When it comes to things that we humans fear, we're kind of programmed to fear the paranormal if we believe in it. It is a non-reciprocal nocturnal threat that is very easy to trigger in our limbic system. However, again, this is just my opinion. I consider paranormal activity to be parlor tricks of a cursed and envious being. But I have the power to send her where she belongs, and she knows it, so she will try her best. He'll try to scare me because he's afraid of me, but that's the way it should be because I'm here to do my job. I guess it's kind of like spiritual pest control, but a moving cup, a whisper, a roar, etc., 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 is not as scary to me as, say, driving in the pouring rain or what I encountered working as a bouncer while studying. People, dogs, and even cats are more dangerous than most ghosts or paranormal phenomena. The exception is obsession, incredibly dangerous, but also insanely rare. I'm not afraid of these things, not because I'm tough or brave or anything like that. but because they're really not that dangerous and should be condemned. That being said, if we do a thorough investigation, it would look something like this. So, we're a medical order. We're also a self-serving branch of the order, and our perspective gives us a different worldview. When we evaluate a person, we look not only at their spiritual health, but also their social, physical, and psychological health. The first thing we would do with full funding is refer the person to a doctor and psychologist for evaluation. It's not because we think they're crazy, it's because we've gotten a full picture of what we're dealing with. If someone tests positive for a physical or mental illness, it could be the cause of symptoms they think are spiritual. We need to treat these problems and see if the symptoms go away. Our church fully covers all costs associated with this process, and if that doesn't solve the problem, my job is to definitively disprove the existence of paranormal activity or presence, but to do so with the belief that a presence can still exist. Most of the time, skepticism is a good thing, but sometimes it's harmful. I know this. We're not here to assume that the problem is common. We take all the information we can, evaluate it, and come up with probable results. And we believe that a spiritual outcome is just as likely as a secular one. However, we still need to disprove all the mundane theories that we can. But there is another layer, because we also need to prove all secular theories. That would help us achieve equality of information, so we can't happily say, oh, it's probably just an everyday thing, unless we can prove it. Then, if the spiritual problem persists, we begin the church's consecrated process of blessing and protecting the afflicted person. These measures vary in intensity depending on the person, their relationship with their faith, and the tenacity of what we are dealing with. I didn't have a standard way to do this either. The standard path is that you attend a church that believes in demonology, participate as much as you can, talk to the pastor about your desire to learn and follow the path, and see if the church will support you. However, it's a long way off. You can also try becoming a chaplain in some denominations, but honestly, the best thing you can do is to wholeheartedly give yourself to the church. Show it that you are ready, and it will support your journey. My path was to study youth psychology and specialize in youth gangs. Then the church started investing in the community and was looking for a Christian with my experience to be a youth pastor. I worked there for a while, and after some traveling, I returned to my home denomination where I work now. I have a master's degree in professional practice, the title of chaplain, and a diploma in demonology. But my background in psychology is what sets me apart in the eyes of the church in this ministry. I am much better equipped to conduct referrals than many priests or parishioners. My training in demonology comes from several sources. I graduated from Bible college and also did some training on Bishop James Long's course. I took an online course from the British Academy of Paranormal Phenomena, as it is not Christian, and spent some time training with our Archbishop to specifically respond to the needs of the community in this regard. In his eyes, this calling of chaplain was within my purview, and when I needed to increase the church's involvement, I went straight to him. He told me about our beliefs, blessings, the workflow of our church, etc. He also told me about our church's position on demonology, which is very old. We're Anglicans. King James was a demonologist, so it's a special area for us. That's pretty much it. I'm always willing to help people, so if you have any problems, contact me via message. I would also be happy to answer questions and join in the discussion, although I'm not going to fully commit to what happens in the stories. For me, it's almost impossible to prove paranormal phenomena on the internet because of the nature of the evidence and how easily it can be faked. So I'm not going to do it. And I've checked these things with my colleagues, so I'm satisfied. But before I wrap up, I'd like to tell a couple more stories. After I started doing more spiritual direction, conflict, and intervention, we started noticing more things going on around the house. One of them was a large, dark figure. They were about 8 feet tall. My height is 180 centimeters, so I'm tall on my own. But this creature was huge. It came out of the underground shelter next to our room. We lived in the basement. After we got involved in one particularly nasty incident, there was a knock on the door from the underground shelter. Once a day, at random times, we heard a simple knocking sound 3 times. It was a room with brick walls and an earthen floor, but no wind or people could get in from the outside. We mostly ignored it, but when the knocking started in my presence, I would read the hammer, letting him know he was not welcome here. My partner, however, opened the door after the knock, but didn't tell me about it. She's not as spiritual as I am, and she was curious to know what that knock was. The next day, we were resting in bed when the guitar next to the door played incredibly loudly twice. I scolded her again, but again, I didn't know she was responding to the knocking. That night I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning, frustrated. So I opened my eyes to go to the phone and then saw a huge black figure about 20 feet away from me, standing in the corner looking at us. She was well built, with broad shoulders and a strong body. I froze in shock at first, and then pointed my phone screen in its direction. But it didn't disappear immediately, which honestly shocked me, but rather slowly dissipated from the bottom to the top. I cast a spell and went to bed. The next night it was exactly the same. I was trying to sleep and had a premonition, and when I was almost asleep I opened my eyes and saw the figure again, only this time it was standing next to the door to the dungeon room. I grabbed my blessed Haya, a Maori weapon, stood up and started reciting a rather serious prayer. This half woke my partner up, but soon he did too, and while I prayed in the dark, the same thing happened. The figure slowly disappeared. The next day my partner asked what I was doing, and I told her. I asked her if she saw anything, and she said she heard a knock and was trying to find the source of it. I asked her if she opened the door after knocking, and she said yes. So I finally did what I was supposed to do, but I was probably too scared at that moment. Suddenly I was in a fight I couldn't win. I was new to all of this at the time and blessed both our room and pantry. I used frankincense and myrrh, holy water and prayers in English, Latin, and my native Maori language. I put an iron cross over the door on the inside of the house and put large wooden crosses over all the entrances to my room, including this one. And thankfully, I haven't had any problems since then, and I've become much more confident with many more contacts. However, I'm still not 100% sure what I was dealing with at that moment. So, if this is true, I would like to know if anyone else has had a similar experience so I can get more information and understand what it might be. Not too long ago, I shared that the howls are heard at night and in the mornings, and I also shared that I've been thinking about and reading about defectors lately. Tonight, my cousin and I helped him install a new basketball hoop. We finished up, and he released some balls while I watched as it got dark. He then asked me if I wanted to go inside. I said yes, and suddenly I heard, "Help me, please help me, please help me, someone help me." It was like a little girl screaming for help near our pond. I was a little shocked by this, and my cousin had already walked in the door but was waiting for me. I was shaking at that moment because I kind of realized what it was as soon as I heard it. The cousin came back, and I didn't hear him again. Then I can't wait to go back inside and tell my fiancée about it. And she looks out the bathroom window because it overlooks the pond and sees the little girl. Not 10 seconds later, she told me to go look, and not 10 seconds later I arrive, and there's nothing there. What the hell was going on? It was pounding and howling at first. But now we have a real experience, and I'm starting to get seriously worried. I, of course, checked to see if there was any sign of a real little girl, but there wasn't. It wasn't a real girl, I'm sure of it, and I know it wasn't. I know who lives in this neighborhood, and I know what's going on here. It's not just some unhappy child, I know that. But I've been reading about defectors and thinking about them. I'm about 60% Aboriginal, and on top of that, I just had a baby. There is a lot of negative stuff going on in the family right now. It's all pretty chaotic, and I think it's fueled by those things. Plus, by the time I got out, there was no way she could have fallen into the pond, and there was no one there at all. There was no splashing or ripples on the water, and when I checked it this morning, there were no tracks, no hair, no shoes, no clothes, nothing. It was messy enough to determine if anyone was there last night. And I think I'm going to start trying to get it all on camera to document it, because it's clear that something weird is going on. I told this story to my friends and family, and they just looked at me like I was crazy. I also told my wife about it when we drove out of the house where it happened. My wife and I lived in Nevada in a newly built 3-story house. The master bedroom was on the 3rd floor, and there was no door to the floor. It was just open, sort of like a loft, but it was a full-fledged plaza, not a converted loft or something like that. It's pretty common in Nevada, so they can stuff as many thin and tall houses as they can into the police station. But somehow one night, about a month after moving into the house, we both fell asleep. I wake up in the middle of the night, like 2 or 4 in the morning, and I see what I can only describe as a small creature at the other end of the room, completely black, and I can't make out any facial features, eyes, or something. Whatever it was small. He must have been 2 meters tall, had 2 arms and legs like a human, but he was a little wider and moved in a non-human way. It was unnaturally fast. He quickly ran to the edge of the bed, and that's when I realized he was looking right at me. I couldn't move, and I remember very clearly thinking, "Oh no, I don't have time for this." I remember it was looking at the mattress and it had a longer nose, but for some reason it wouldn't or couldn't get on the bed or something. I watched for about 10 seconds and then I thought, well, if he can't get up, I'll just roll over. I rolled over and nothing else happened that night. I know the ending is pretty disappointing, but that's exactly what happened to me that night. I didn't see anything else in the house except that night. I did wake up and could move, so it wasn't sleep paralysis. I've had this happen before, but it was much worse and much scarier. I guess I'm just wondering if there is a name for what I saw, or if something like this has happened to anyone else and what it was. It happened to me in my early teens. I'm 21 now, and my childhood best friend had a huge farmhouse in central Virginia. It was very old and beautiful, but also with a very dark history. There is a tunnel in the house that leads to an underground room where slaves hid in the 1800 cess. And I'm 90% sure that some of them died there while they were hiding. So you can imagine the history and energy filling that house. I've always been scared too. I never felt alone and never went anywhere alone in the house, even to get something from my room, the rooms I lived in. Even the family was afraid to stay there without company because of the high winds. Also the experiences, which I'll tell you about another time. The rooms were huge, and the whole house was white with creepy vintage decor. There was even a study upstairs with dolls. No, I'm not kidding. To be fair, it was a very old family with a lot of dark issues, but whatever. The second time I visited this house was with my mom, my best friend, and her mom. It was a girls' trip. I woke up one night and I was really thirsty, and the last thing I wanted to do was go downstairs and get some water. I mean, I was terrified, just like everyone else. I hated that house at night, but my mom was almost asleep, so I literally ran down the stairs looking only at the floor. I got my water in 5 seconds, and when I got to the stairs, something made me look up at the huge glass door in front of the stairs. I was terrified, but I don't know, I just felt like I had to look out the window. What I saw when I looked out the window will haunt me for the rest of my life, because I saw a man standing there, as real as anyone I'd ever seen. It was pitch dark outside, and a huge bright moon was shining. The man was completely black as a silhouette, but because the moon was so bright I could see his whole body clearly. He was blacker than black, kind of stood out so much that I 100% mistook him for an intruder. He wore a hat and was inhumanly tall, over 7 feet. My heart seemed to stop beating, and for a moment I felt as if I were in some kind of trance. I was in such sudden terror, but I couldn't look away. He was also moving slightly, almost seemed to be breathing, and then, after about 10 seconds, it disappeared, seemingly vanishing into thin air. I panicked and rushed upstairs, coming out of the trance. I cried in front of my mom and stayed up all night and didn't sleep a wink after that. The next morning, I told my friend and her mom about it, and they were not shocked in the least. Since they themselves had seen ghosts in the house many times at full size, it didn't bother them. I later learned that the nanny who worked for them refused to go into certain rooms of the house, even from her own experience. But after that, I never went back to that house again. This experience happened a long time ago, but I thought I'd share it here for you guys to hear. So, in the mid-2000s, I lived in this house with my dad, mom, and sister. Across the street from this house was a huge mansion with many living quarters that my family, including myself, considered cursed. Honestly, my sister and I were afraid of it because it was a big dark house that seemed uncomfortable and cold. When my family moved into our house, the mansion across the street was occupied by a wealthy businessman who had moved in a few months before us. This guy was really rich. Luxury cars, massive dinner parties with rich friends, etc. Apparently, he owned a bunch of businesses, started a new business shortly after we moved in, and almost 6 months after opening that business, he went bankrupt. He lost everything, sold all his luxury cars, stopped having dinner parties, and quickly became an alcoholic. He eventually sold his house because of course he couldn't afford it. But after he sold the house, a young, recently married couple moved in. I have no idea how they were able to afford the house, but they moved in anyway and settled in quickly. My parents became very good friends with them, and we would occasionally have them over for dinner. They lived in the house for about 2 years, but in those 2 years they had 3 miscarriages. As a result, the wife became depressed, and even had to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital because she was considering removal. These 2 instances could be written off as just bad luck, perhaps bad luck, but the third, in my opinion, confirms that this house is cursed. After another couple decided to move in, another couple moved into the house, and this couple was quite wealthy. They hired a maid to live in the house and help them cook, clean, etc. After they lived there for a year, we became close to the couple again, and would sometimes take them out to dinner and swim in the pool they also had. One night, my father woke up with a strange premonition. Apparently, he heard something outside, so he looked out of his bedroom window and saw the maid packing his car in the middle of the night. The couple living there apparently went away for the weekend, and the maid was left alone in the house. He thought it was strange and got a little worried, but didn't think much of it and went to sleep. After he fell asleep again, he had a horrible nightmare in which the maid committed suicide in the garage of the house. When he woke up in the morning, he was a little shaken up from the dream and had a sort of sixth sense. He decided to go over there and see if everything was okay. He rang the doorbell but got no answer. Then he decided to go around the back of the house and see if the back door was locked. The back door was unlocked and he went inside. He walked into the living room and saw that his dream had come true. He immediately ran home and called the police and ambulance, but when they arrived it was too late. I remember seeing my father after the event and he was as pale as a ghost. Of course, he didn't tell us about the incident because we were very young. He ended up telling us when I was 15, 16 or so. And I don't tell him about it because he hates to talk about it and is very emotional about it. We moved a short time after the last event happened. I still don't know what happened to the next family that moved here, but I really hope nothing bad happened to them. However, I am still convinced that this mansion is cursed. One night, in the small town where we lived, my 3 friends and I were sitting in the backyard at a picnic table. So we were all facing the same direction and looking up at the clear night sky. We had just left the bar, chatting about this and that, smoking ale, and suddenly out of nowhere, we saw something very large, completely black, triangular shaped, without any lights appear in the night sky. In a split second, we saw it move from one end of the sky to the other and cover the stars. It was very massive, about the size of a soccer field. We all looked at each other and simultaneously exclaimed, "Did you just see that?" It was just crazy, and I'll never forget it. But then, a few weeks after this incident, I had a very vivid dream in which I was lying on a very cold operating table with beings that I felt were not human, and they seemed to tickle me at every touch, almost like a faint electric current. There were several of them, touching me in different places at the same time. It was weird because I could feel their physical touch while I slept, like I was actually there. I didn't see anything while it was happening. I'm pretty sure I had something over my face so I couldn't see them or anything around me. However, I didn't feel threatened or intimidated by them, which was a little strange because honestly, I probably should have. The dream ended abruptly, and I woke up in my bed. But it was so real that I still firmly believe I may have been abducted in my sleep so they could study me. Since then, I thankfully haven't seen a black triangle in the sky or dreamed of an abduction. To me, it was one of the strangest experiences to date. I'm wondering if anyone here has had a similar experience. When I was a kid, I lived in Clinton, Tennessee. Both of my parents worked full-time, so I was often sent to visit my grandparents, who had a piece of land near Moosheim, not far from Greenville, but not quite in it. They had both lived in East Tennessee all their lives, and in the area for many years. They had settled into their home decades before this story and stayed there for a long time. I recently had an excuse to return to these parts, having spent most of my adult life in the state of North Carolina. Staying there and traveling the same roads reminded me of my lazy summer days spent at my grandparents' house. I learned to shoot with the same .22 caliber that my grandfather had taught my mother by feeding fish in the neighbor's stocked pond, or just watching deer and bears through binoculars from the back porch. When I told my mom about it, she in turn told me the story of how I scared the hell out of my grandfather and then lied about having sex with a snowman. I honestly had no idea what she was talking about at first. But then I remembered with surprising clarity what really happened. I think it was some new context, providing the experience of adulthood. And no, it's not about a snowman or a cryptid. But before we begin, a little backstory about my grandparents' land. Their house stood on a small hill surrounded by a grassy meadow. The meadow turned into a small hayfield and then into a forest. The forest stretched for a good half-mile on either side of the house and a few miles behind. I hated making hay because it was too painful to play on, but I loved spending time in the creek that flowed behind it. To get there, I walked to the edge of the property, along the woodline, to avoid the hayride. And when I was at my grandparents' house, the only rule was that I had to stay where I could see the house, and the house could see me. I also had to take a whistle with me wherever I went. I didn't take a whistle, considering it a sign of my sad youth, and most of the creek remained out of sight of the house. In fact, it was the only area where the depth was above my knees, and thus the only area where I could swim. Naturally, I spent most of my time in that water, splashing, rolling rocks, and just being a kid. But one day I was playing stream, and I noticed someone. It was a strange man who sat on the bank and watched me. He had long hair, a beard, and pale skin so dirty that spots showed through it. I couldn't tell its age and just assumed it was old. Now I don't have a better guess, as he had clearly endured many years of hard living. He wasn't wearing a shirt or pants, just a dirty cloth wrapped around his waist, which I then mistook for something like Moses' clothes, thanks to the illustrated Bible stories I'd heard as a kid. Around his neck hung several necklaces made of knotted scraps of cloth, fibers, and rope. In these knots were woven various parts, mostly bones, but also flowers and pieces of dark glass. When I first saw him there, I was horrified. I froze in place. The man, however, was smiling. He made a gesture, squatting with his outstretched arm, thumbs down as if waving at me not to stop. I didn't react at first. I guess I was just stunned. Then he splashed me, still smiling. He did it again. I slapped him, and soon we were playing. We both poured water on each other, and he jumped into the creek and stomped along with me, laughing the whole time. He was throwing rocks into the water, and so was I. I pushed him. He pushed me away. We continued like this for a few minutes, until I got a call from my grandmother. The switch went off along with her voice. The man also stopped where he was, staring in the direction of the house. Then, while Grandma continued to yell, he looked at me. He crawled to his side of the creek, barely disturbing the water, and then slipped into the bushes, all the while keeping his eyes on me. When he disappeared from sight, I waited in the water until my grandmother found me. She asked if I was alone, and I said no. She got very tense, asking who was with me and looking around. I didn't respond because at that moment I just didn't know how to. Seeing no one, she dragged me back into the house without saying a word, all the while holding me in her arms like iron. A veritable inquisition began in the house, and I had no new words to say. Perhaps this event and this reaction robbed me of my ability to explain. This silence made my grandmother even more angry, and I was quickly cornered and held without bail pending the patriarch's verdict. About an hour later, Grandpa came home from work. He had been told of my talkativeness and was ready to pounce on me again when I spoke. I told him about the man, hairy and old, dressed like Moses, how he had played and then disappeared. I remember them digesting it for a few minutes before sending me to my room. Honestly, I was glad to get away, and even more glad when Grandpa didn't yell at me like he usually did when I misbehaved. Later, dinner was brought to me. I was eating in the kitchen with Grandma, but Grandpa called me to the back porch. He sat on a rickety bench and looked out over the hayfield, reddened by the setting sun. He took off his shoes and put them next to the gun. I realized it was weird to get the gun out of the closet. We shot bottles with it. Some I tossed in the air as if they were clay pigeons or something. But these antics were accompanied by speeches about how the gun was dangerous and only adults could use it. He listened to my story again, his tone completely serious. Eventually, he asked me how hairy the man really was. I answered like that, figuring that was the right answer. He asked where, and I said everywhere, like a bear. He thought about it, and I got more and more nervous, worried that I was getting in trouble or causing trouble, and just wanted the trouble, wherever it was, to end. So when he finally asked me to swear by Christ or my mother that I was telling the truth about everything, I said I was kidding. Eventually he yelled and sent me back to my room. After that, the family started remembering that I hid in the creek and made up a snowman story. At the time, everyone took offense to me and I was banned from returning to the stream or anywhere else. This rule, like the others, was not strictly enforced. Nevertheless, for a while I didn't go back there. My recollection is that I didn't stay there long, but I'm sure it was only a few days, and the interruptions seemed endless. When I went to the creek again, I took a bucket of toys with me, mostly Godzilla's, and a thick stick I snapped off a tree branch along the way. I think I was worried about what to do when the man returned. I imagined surprising him with my toy collection, or hitting him with a baton, or both. When he did return, he appeared beside me as I dozed under a tree on my side of the creek. I was struck with terror again. He wasn't smiling, his face expressionless as he stood next to me and watched me for an unknown amount of time before I smelled his scent. I rushed away, leaving the stick and toys behind. Rising to his feet, he shouted. I stood in the sun, and the man watched me from the shadows. Eventually, he sat down and began to examine my bucket. I remember resenting him as he went through my toys one by one and then tossed them in the dirt. At some point, it became too much, and I started reading him notes, telling him how he had given me trouble, how strange he was, and how he stank. At some point, he stopped watching my stuff and quietly observed my tirade, his face neutral, his gaze analytical. When he finished his lecture, I sat down under the tree again and started blowing while basking in the sunshine. I remember the man let out a sort of squeal, and when I looked at him, he was chuckling as he examined the last few figures in my bucket. I wanted to laugh too, but decided to remain sullen. When everything was taken out of the bucket, he put one figure, Hidara, back in the bucket. Then he stood up to his full, hunched stature, took the bucket by the handle, and walked back into the woods. I stayed near the tree line until he turned, said something, but not a word I knew or recognized, and pointed forward with his hand. At first I didn't comply, even though I knew he wanted me to follow him. After a few moments he hissed, snapped his teeth, and gestured again, already more insistent. After that, I got up and followed him while the man made soothing noises and smiled again. We went into the woods. The man was ahead, but naturally he was faster and quieter, so it was hard to catch up with him. Finally, having lost me, he stopped, tapped his sticks on the trees, and whistled for me to find him among the vegetation. However, he never came back for me, preferring instead to lead me forward with sounds. And it was at that point that I walked away from the place.